All right. Well, Dr. Lomax, pleasure to have you on here. For those who have never met Dr. Lomax, Brian is a former competitive tennis player, uh, tennis coach, and now as well certified mental performance consultant. And I have Brian on today to discuss professional philosophy. Uh, Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about that in the community, and because of Brian's experiences as a little bit of a Renaissance man, taking things in different perspectives and roles, I thought it'd be great to have Brian kickstart this conversation and also shine a little spotlight on our own community member who is off and doing some amazing things in the world of tennis right now. And so by professional philosophy, we're just talking about the thought process behind our work. What are some of those things that drive that, influence it, so we can engage in work in a meaningful and systematic way. And so I guess as we dive into this topic, anything else that you would like to add before we get going today, Ryan?
Well, first of all, Russ, thanks for having me be part of this series. And, we've had a lot of discussions in our time together about philosophy and whether it's a professional philosophy or just philosophy in general. And so, it's a topic that has kind of really, I would say, become a foundation of the work that I do, but also just maybe of who I am and how I have evolved from, really a 20-year career in computer science and information technology to then shifting into a sports psych career. And a lot of that path was, one of discovery and one of thinking of, or coming up with different ways of thinking, different perspectives that could really help me. And I think a big part of the switch was really trying to determine more meaning and fulfilling activities in my own life, which my, you know, last particular position or even just that 20-year career wasn't doing anymore. I mostly worked for financial services companies and I wasn't connecting with that mission, but also I wasn't out there designing my own meaningful life. I was more taking things by default, and at a certain point that reached a head and I needed to change. And so luckily I kind of thought of this, and you mentioned that the competitive tennis playing. That was really the beginning, Russ, of exploring who I was and how I could change the way I think, and more, yeah, I guess I was client zero, and put that together and see what happened. And it just opened up some possibilities in my own mind of being able to do this in a certain way. It wasn't perfect, but look what happened when I committed to it. And then, all right, could I help other people do this? Because I didn't at the time. This was like more 2008, 2009. Didn't necessarily see a lot of people doing mental training in a progressive, systematic way, and so I thought that could be a meaningful contribution to the world and to a community, at least for me, that was also a big part of who I am, which is the tennis community. I think another part of driving meaning in your life is, for some of us, is giving back to a community that was perhaps instrumental in our own development, and that's how I felt. So I've done a lot of volunteering in the tennis community, but this was like another way to serve it, and the coaching aspect really helped with that. So I am, I guess that's a little bit more background on how I got to where I am, because many of the people who may be even watching this from a sports psych perspective, we might even have the same level of experience, but I'm 55 and have had a whole other life in a way of different things go on that drove me to where I am today.
Well, I think you kind of teed that up pretty nice for the opening question here, because I think you gave nice context of some of the influences on where you're at, and I think we'll be able to dive a little bit more in that in a second. But if to kick it off, what is your philosophy today, and then what has been the biggest influences on in its development?
Yeah. Well, I guess when I think about maybe distinguish a little bit between, say, professional philosophy and personal philosophy. So we'll start with personal philosophy, because I think that's actually sort of, if we're drawing like kind of circles here, that's probably the bigger one. And I like to think of one's personal philosophy as really your personal operating system. So, for example, everybody has some sort of phone, whether it's an iPhone or some sort of Android phone, and both of those devices have operating systems. Now, you're vaguely aware of that, right? Android or iOS, but you don't really engage with it sort of very overtly. You're just using apps on there. And those apps, their ability to perform well, whether they're fast, responsive, etc., completely depend on the operating system. And if you have an operating system, this is probably more common for computers, that is has a virus, then you're going to notice the functionality of that not working so well. And so a personal philosophy, a personal operating system, is trying to have better ideas behind how you think so that you can be more functional in what you're trying to do, have better perspectives on things, hopefully be more positive, drive more meaningful work in your cells, better relationships. And I like to think of human beings, Russ, as sort of like, we start off with sort of like human being operating system 1.0. And much of that is still geared toward a world from thousands, if not millions of years ago, in which we were, living either in caves or in the savannah, where, a lot of life and death was more at the forefront of one's mind than today. And yet some of those same sort of responses, same sort of survival responses occur in our everyday lives, yet many of the things we face day to day are not necessarily existential, depending on one's circumstances. And certainly not for me, working a lot with tennis players, it's not often a life or death situation. And so I felt like I personally needed an upgrade. I needed to go from sort of human 1.0 to something better than that. Same as your phone gets updated every now and then. A new version of iOS comes out, new version of Android comes out, and it's an improvement on what's happened. And so I think we can be looking at that for ourselves, is how do we develop new perspectives, new ways of thinking, so that we can function in the world more efficiently, better, be better people of character, etc. So that would be sort of more the personal piece. I think the professional philosophy is then more about how does one practice in your profession, in something like sports psychology, which involves, I would say, for those of us those watching, many of you have probably developed your own theoretical orientation of performance excellence. That's certainly a part of it, is how do you view that large question of performance excellence, and also then how do you work toward helping others attain that? So I think, for me, the philosophical background is a big part of my own professional philosophy as well. And I think there are lessons from existential philosophy, which is really a lot about, again, meaning of life, but in some ways almost the absurdity of life, but thinking of things as projects, etc. I think Stoicism has been certainly more popularized these days with Ryan Holiday and his work and so forth, and his books are certainly well worth a read. Even Toltec philosophy, sort of an ancient civilization in Mexico. And they all, again, just try to help athletes think a little bit differently, frame things differently, so that they can reduce maybe the amount of pressure that they feel when they're performing. And just then becomes more of a window into sort of the practical side of things. So part of why I designed my taupe in really two stages was, if you are thinking better ideas behind how you think, it becomes easier to implement many of the practical strategies and techniques, because you already are coming at it from a more positive place than perhaps just a sort of survival type of place. And so I really try to help athletes think better, and then convert that into things that they can actually do, and practice and experience. So in this process, it's all about helping athletes find their way. I can often talk about, and I don't do this that much, but I might talk about the Brian way. Well, the Brian way is not going to work necessarily for Russ. It's not going to necessarily work for somebody else. It might be a good starting point to have the conversation, but in essence, I want people to experience new ways of thinking and experience new experiences in whatever context they're in. And then we talk about that. And then we work on, how do we make this your way? Right. And tennis is a great sport to do this in, because if you look at all the top players in the world, even just at a technical perspective, none of them hit this forehand the same way. It's all different. They do it their way. And each one of them has signature strengths that distinguish them from other people. And so I try to communicate that as much as possible, that this is really a process of self-knowledge, self-discovery, awareness, so that you can grow into that best person and best athlete that you can be. And I'm kind of here to help you along that journey and talk through it. And I can give ideas on how to, or what different things to try on that journey. And, oftentimes it's like going to a department store and trying on some different clothes. Some of them will feel better than others. Some may not work at all in your mind, but that's okay. Give it a wholehearted try, and then you'll know from the experience. So I would say, my professional philosophy is a lot about helping people think differently, as well as being more practical in the approach. And certainly the relationship is very important to
Yeah.
me. And really just having that conversation about what you're experiencing when you are performing or practicing, or even outside of that context.
Well, you hit on a couple things there that's really fascinating. So one, um, even for myself, when I think about professional philosophy, my personal experiences are part of that. I never considered it personal philosophy, but we can't leave those things at the door from my observation. So, but I also am glad to see that you tease the two apart. Your personal philosophy from your professional philosophy, because at some point I'm going to have a philosophy behind my work, and what influences that. And I think, to echo your point, my personal development is also really paramount, and I want to spend just a more second on that here in a minute. um, but when it comes to professionally, though, there's going to be things I learn, my education, that's going to help influence, because there's things that might resonate with me. And I actually liked your athlete analogy, because I think it works for us too. There's going to be certain things that we might try on there, like that resonates. And then there's going to be things that don't. Um, but then also my personal experiences and my own work on myself and how I view things is going to have an influence, and whether that's just my style or, my worldviews, right? I think that's interesting. Um, but the one thing you mentioned, and I hadn't thought about this way, but I think it's a really important point. The idea of philosophy in general. You and I have talked about this quite a bit, whether it's, um, philosophy as it stood before psychology was invented, but the term philosophy tends to be viewed as a subjective, less meaningful science somehow. I don't know how it's kind of gotten distilled down, where we talk about philosophy and it's like, well, that's just a personal opinion. And yet philosophy is a lot more than that. And I even think about the distinction between, if we're looking at just cognitive approaches, get in the weeds for a second for those listening, um, Beck versus Ellis, very, very similar. And yet what differed? Their underlying philosophy a little bit. Ellis paid a little bit more attention to things like, unconditional positive regard, in which a lot of people might, for example, think, well, that's a little bit mindfulness. What's that going on, right? But the idea, though, of philosophy, which is kind of cool, is, from an actual operational definition, If we're going toward doing work with philosophy, that means we're operating with a certain set of assumptions. And that's cool. And that can be systematic, that can be very professional. So there's a lot of layers here, but it was the way you had mentioned philosophy that made me think of what philosophy is too at its most basic principle. Like if I'm going to go forward with the scientific method, there's a process I'm following. There's things I might be doing. Think about motivation when we're doing our work. As a field, we operate under the philosophy that people are motivated to make change. Well, we also run into people who aren't, right? So it doesn't mean it's all, but it gives us a guide, right? Then we kind of come in there. So I think that's very interesting. And you made me think of that. And then lastly, and feel free to jump on in after this, but then also lastly, when it comes to the philosophy here, we still haven't even gotten into the specific skills and strategies. We're just talking about the overarching perspective that I'm taking to go do the work. And that has influence from our personal experiences, professional experiences, and of course our education. But the way you had walked through those two there made me think of all these things. And I think for those listening, just kind of put a little period at the end of my thought process here. There's a lot of influences on what our philosophy does, but our philosophy is the starting point to start organizing what we've learned, whether it's from school, life experiences, as well as professional experiences as well. But it is a starting point to kind of start putting up a way to organize what we're doing. So I just wanted to put a pause in there. Anything else as I was saying there? Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, no, actually quite a few things. I should have written them down. It came to mind as you were going on
this. Yeah.
on there. I think, when it comes to philosophy, there's also other things that you can be including in there, which are, your values, what at least the ones that you believe are important to you. How you regard other people, etc. And so I think that's also an interesting approach to look at, because we are, I guess if I were to give myself sort of an identity. So one of the things I do every morning, I do this thing called a Carpe Diem journaling exercise. And it will sound repetitive, but then again, so is meditating. So it's a great way of, setting intentions for the day. And so I look at three major areas of life: energy, work, and love. And you can think back to these are almost very similar to other motivational theories, whether it's self-determination theory or David McClelland's theories of dominant motives. But for each one of those, I create or write about an identity that I aspire to be every day. So I'll go through the energy one because it's the easiest one. So from a physical energy perspective, mental energy perspective, I treat myself as if I'm a professional athlete. Now, obviously I'm not, but if I want to conduct myself like a professional athlete and have the energy of a professional athlete, I will probably have a good day. I'll be focused. I'll have, good kind of presence and energy throughout the day. So the next piece after that, as I set that as my identity for the day, would be what are the virtues I need to embody in order to be a professional athlete today? Maybe discipline, focus, confidence, commitment, purpose, enthusiasm. There are a lot of different things. And then lastly, what are the behaviors I'm going to do today that will support my identity of being a professional athlete? And that could be, maybe specific things about my workout or a tennis practice, how I'm eating, my hydration, other aspects of things, maybe how I wind down at the end of the day, make sure I get a good night's sleep and flow into the next day. Now I do this for work too. And so I've often referred to myself as, hopefully you like this, Russ, as a positive philosopher coach.
There you go.
I think I'm positive, I like to bring the philosophy piece to this, and I see myself as a coach or maybe even a teacher at certain points, right? And then there are virtues and behaviors that are associated with that. So I think that's maybe getting a little bit more toward like what my virtues and values that are important to me are, and that I want to actively practice them, because we can all think we're great people, but it really comes down into what you do. And so to
Well,
me, that's
I think
important.
though, I think it also just helps we can focus right in on the work itself. What is the science you're taking in there? But I
Yeah.
think it's extremely insightful to see what we're doing to support ourselves around the work as well.
Mhm.
This is something that you found benefit in and kind of going through as a way to kind of guide your approach to your day,
Yeah.
let alone, okay, today I'm going to be teaching attention shifting, right? Or something, very minute for a very specific reason. But I think there's a lot of value in people being to hear about just how you kind of put your day in a week type thing together as well. I think that's very insightful.
Yeah. And it's been very helpful to do that, and it's helped, especially in the relationship side of things, whether that's with my clients, my wife, or some of the friends. Um, yeah, and being sort of a natural introvert, it gets me a little bit out of that at times.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say just about philosophy in general, Russ, is that I don't know how you feel about this, but I have read that there are in the world of psychology, there's sometimes a discomfort with philosophy, almost a
Yeah.
denial of the fact that psychology really came about out of philosophy. That's really where it all began. Um, I don't necessarily look at philosophy as necessarily an opinion per se, although it's maybe they're proposals about how they think life works or whatever. And again, you can try on your own, just like you can try on a lot of different things. But um, sometimes the one thing I try to have a caveat with myself about is this idea of scientism versus more the unique experiences of individuals, more the humanism piece,
Yeah.
right? And
Yep.
this idea of everything must be evidence based. I'm going to be honest, I don't necessarily believe that. I believe that not everything has been researched, and you may come across case studies in which certain things work for certain people. It's okay to listen to that, because there are no studies that show this will work 100% of the time for every single person.
I'm gonna hop in because you're echoing sentiments of my own heart here. But I also think coming back to the philosophy piece within that, we're talking about also, can you maintain perspective to see through, right, what the research is telling us because
Yeah,
of what you just said.
don't be dogmatic about the whole
Yeah,
thing,
it's
right?
not, nothing is ever do this, you'll get that. Research is done the best we can. Um, but there's a reason why there's so many research studies, because they have to be set up in such a specific way to get certain conditions truly tested, that we get all this information. We're the ones that have to internalize it. And I think this is the part that's so fun. And this might sound like it's separate, going into a separate topic, but I think it's related. There's a reason why I also don't agree with this privacy of knowledge. Like, what are we
Yeah,
safeguarding? Because our philosophy, our personal influences, you and I could be teaching the exact same skill or topic to the same audience, and we could have the same PowerPoint presentation we're following, and they will be delivered to very different ways. Why? Because why was it after slide 2 you noticed something in the room and stopped and asked a question? Or why is it that your context or your spinner, so there's so much nuance that's so unique to us, right, that I think really all I'm getting at is, and this comes back to your very first point, which I'm so glad that you're kicking this topic off. Do I have some thoughtfulness behind what I'm doing? Can I think a little bit more about what I'm about to say? Because the more we're looking at it from different angles, which is, yes, I have personal experience, but that's not enough. Yes, I can learn things in school, but that's not enough by itself, because of what you just said. If I'm just solely going off research studies or theories, even if I understand them very well, that in and of itself isn't enough. But then also, I might have professional experiences working with a lot of clients on the same topic. But there's that human perspective where everyone experiences a little bit differently. That may not be enough. But the more we can kind of scaffold it and look at it, now when we're approaching what we're doing, there's a more robust thoughtfulness behind it, in my opinion. And I think that is one of the biggest value adds of thinking about philosophy, is because philosophy was a science, still is, right? I think to your point, and so I'm also agreeing with you on how I've seen psychology kind of take it, and people have a certain perception of what philosophy represents. But philosophy, to me, is the underpinning of everything we're doing, the way we're learning about ourselves and the world around us, how we're taking in knowledge and applying that. Um, and this is a total side plug, but if any of you are listening, uh, I love research on wisdom, because I think the research on wisdom really starts opening up this whole floodgate on what we're talking about here. Not in the same context per se, but it's definitely in the same family. And this whole idea of being able to read between the lines, have some thoughtfulness behind what we're doing, patience and compassion and everything, I think kind of opens it up there. So anyway, little side plug for those listening. Wisdom research is really insightful too. And I think does a nice job of kind of towing that line between some psychology and philosophy as well. But you made me think about that as you were talking.
Well, I think also is that not something we could help our clients to develop, regardless of age? Can we start introducing some of these better ways of thinking, such that they can gain some experience and thus gain some wisdom around what they're doing? One of the assignments that I give to many of the clients that I've worked with for an extended period of time is I will ask them to write their own personal philosophy of
Yeah,
performance excellence. And it's often very fascinating to read those. And I learn a lot by reading those. And it's great if you have a 16-year-old athlete who has her own now philosophy of performance excellence that she has put together. She's written, she came up with the topic, she wrote the paragraphs to describe it, and now has something to really begin to live towards and to practice. The other thing about philosophy, and I think the Stoics were very good at this, is that philosophy is not just like talking, exchanging ideas. Philosophy ought to be practiced.
yeah,
And they did a lot of it back in sort of ancient Greece and Rome. A lot of that was done through wrestling and as a means of doing it. And we can be using sport for the same thing. I will often bring more of an existential approach to this and just say, let's say, Russ, you and I are like we're visiting Earth from some other planet, and we
yeah,
zoom in, we take a look and we see two people hitting this yellow, fuzzy, pressurized ball back and forth between lines, and people are getting super emotional about it. And you might just be like, that's absurd. What's happening here? What, right? And then you're also, if you're a tennis player, you're voluntarily entering events in which you're torturing yourself. There's got to
yeah,
be a better reason to do some of this, right? So maybe you can even look at it from a bigger picture perspective, is that you are putting yourself into certain experiences that will stress who you are. And that stress is really telling you you have a lesson to learn. And the more you can be open to learning that lesson, adopting a different way of thinking, right? Because you can't just wish it away. You can't
yeah,
try to avoid it. There'll be no growth there. And in many ways, sport is an arena for people to almost become superheroes in terms of their ability to handle stress. And you face many, what I would call necessary experiences on
yeah,
the path to becoming a better human being. And whether that's dealing with pressure, dealing with teammates, learning to finish something well. There are so many necessary experiences that can be brought out through sport. And to me, I see part of my role is guiding people through these necessary experiences so that in the end, they become better people. They become stronger. And I think one's philosophy is a huge part of that, and developing wisdom through, the practice
yeah,
of philosophy. And it goes the same on the professional side for us. we have to, yeah, you can have a philosophy where you can say, all right, my important values are gratitude and whatever. But if you don't practice it, then it's not really generating you into the kind of person you want to be. So philosophy, it's not just a document, it's a practice. It's a way to practice, a way of being. And it's the same for our athletes.
Well, and if I may, and if I'm misrepresenting what you're saying, you stop me. But I think one thing that's really fascinating about this is everything you're discussing is process. And I was trying to mention this earlier, but I think we were kind of more on the philosophy point, the introduction to it. But skills are a dime a dozen. You can teach them any point, but the point though of the empowerment there, right? They're writing their own story. They're taking charge of that. And we're there as a guide. I share a very, very similar um, description. I say facilitator, but it operates this definitionally the same way. But I'm going to help you put a process together because it's that process you can follow. And then as you're trying on different skills over your career, because skills are things that we always want to continue to sharpen and look at, you're confident enough to know that I can try new skills, right? Because I have processes that I can follow and it empowers me, right? It's not about Russ's way or Brian's way. Sure, we'll give some examples or probably, some pointers here and there if that's what's required. But we're also talking about now more self-motivated, self-driven, autonomous, competent people. And I think there's a real gap in that today's performance realm. And I don't mean to sound cliche, but I think professionals and coaches are really good at telling people what to do. I think they really struggle in that connection between teaching them how to do it. It's
Yeah,
almost
or
like teaching them how to
how to
fish.
feel it. Yeah.
Yeah. So you just made me think of that. And I wanted to highlight that. And because I think that what this whole philosophy can really do, and the fact that you literally use it in your practice to help athletes well is, I think, always such something fascinating and unique to your approach. Because I don't see a lot of people doing that. And I've even tried to look at now, how can I incorporate that as well a little bit? But I think that's really important because you're really allowing them to create their own process for success. And then before I forget, you said something here that I think is so monumental, and that is helping people navigate their thinking first, right? So the philosophy, let's just now, and for those who are familiar with the TOPE, theoretical orientation, performance excellence, or other models, when you talk about foundation, for me, this is what I'm talking about, because this is something that everybody can benefit for, whether it's engaging in a level of being more intentional, right? Whatever the phrase is you're using, but that is paramount and central. And I don't want to say independent of performance because that's not fair, but kind of, because let me just have a way of being first. And now we can look at the opportunities to really enhance something, because the enhancement piece tends to be more situational. But can I just engage in a way of being first? And so for those of you who are looking at, now we're kind of coming down to the science piece, that's where things like, how am I helping someone do that? Is that more from a mindfulness lens? Is that more from a cognitive lens? Some combination of things, but that's its own thing and may really allow you to kind of come into your own when it comes to kind of establishing a foundational way of how you operate. You just made me think of that when you were talking earlier, and I just wanted to bring it back at some point for those listening. But I think it is really important. Like, how are we also helping people operate a certain way? And then we can also, then after that, we can really layer in some of the nuances of training elements after that. But I just really like that because I think it's important and necessary to give people a compass with how they're operating first. Uh,
Yeah.
you know,
I mean, a great example of that, Russ, use a tennis example because I think something that both tennis and baseball share that make those sports particularly challenging is that you must finish. There's no
hmm,
clock to run out, can't coast into the end. And so a great challenge for many tennis players is this idea of being able to finish the match, and very often, default ways of thinking crop up, like loss aversion. You could be up 5-4, and many athletes are thinking more about protecting that 5-4 lead than they are about building on it. And then that leads to different ways, different emotions that get involved. And so, maybe more on the science side, one of the theories of emotion that I really like is Lisa Feldman Barrett's theory of constructed emotions, in which she says that the brain is not a stimulus response machine. It's actually a prediction machine. And so when one finds himself or herself in that 5-4 situation, what's really going on are a number of predictions going through the mind. And based on what your operating system says, you're going to land on a particular prediction, which may be about avoiding losing, as opposed to what do I have to gain here, and being excited about the challenge or the opportunity. And so let's say you're working with somebody in that situation who's struggling to finish and close. If you don't address this idea of what you're going to be predicting in that situation, you can teach them how to breathe and relax and work on this as much as you want. You may get some level of success, but if they're going into it predicting loss or being more worried about that, it's going to be very hard for them to get through that. And so there could be more than just, say, changing it to an embrace the challenge or look at the opportunity and whatever. There might also have to be some self-image work, because maybe they think of themselves as someone who always chokes in that situation.
Yeah.
And maybe that part has to be changed, right? And so I think I'm just sort of reinforcing what you said there. You're presented with a situation, you have to look at both sides of that.
Well, and I think you're kind of naturally transitioning here, because I do want to be respectful of your time, um, to this idea of how do we decide what to teach, right, or put into play. How has your philosophy influenced what theories or approaches? And you don't have to go through all the weeds of every single theory or approach, but I'm just curious, what role has your philosophy had in what theories you've choose and created exercises from?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things, Russ, that it's helped create is being really open-minded about looking across the spectrum of different things, and not being dogmatic about a particular theory or whatever. But there are a lot of great things that one may find useful. I do like this idea of the theory of constructed emotions. I think too often we think it's stimulus response or stimulus reaction. And this also kind of supports my perspective too, that, I
Yeah.
want to work on that piece so that you can construct better emotions. But with certain clients, I've definitely used a lot more mindfulness. I would say within the last year, I've been paying attention to that more. I've even started using a little bit of a biofeedback device. It's really just a kind of a passive neurofeedback device that helps you understand when your mind is active, neutral, or calm, and using that with athletes to kind of drive more calmness into who they are. I would say that I have started to do much more around feel as a way of thinking, because again, I'll use a tennis example. Let's say you're a tennis coach and you go watch your student play in a tournament, and they're struggling with the serve or something, and your automatic reaction will be, oh, we got to work on the serve, there's technique issues, and so forth. And I will always tell coaches, I'm like, it's not the technique. They could do it in practice. Can't do it in a match. So it's not technique. You going out and doing this may help a little bit, but you got to teach them how to feel what they're doing more, and what that's like. What's the tension in their hand in practice versus what it is in a match, right? You really got to open up that level of self-awareness to things. And so just opening up a student's mind to feel much more than technique can be huge in terms of their results. Yeah, I've liked a lot of sort of like when we were talking of many of the cognitive aspects of things. But like I said, I like to be open-minded. I like to read a lot of different things
Yeah.
that can just, I think, improve what I do and shape who I am. And I'm not afraid to read stuff from people who are great athletes who have perspectives. They
Yeah.
may not be, a master's or a doctorate or a CMPC, but this person has attained something. I can probably learn from that. There
Yeah.
might be some real nuggets in there, right? Whether that's Kobe Bryant
Hmm.
or, Megan Rapinoe or somebody. A lot of these biographies, especially, have just these nuggets of like, wow, that worked for them. Even like with Kobe, the thing I really think about is his willingness to ask questions,
Yeah.
his willingness to publicly say, I want to be the greatest ever, but not just saying it,
Yeah.
doing it, And so I would say, stay open-minded about stuff. And it's okay to even if somebody just calls himself a mind coach, great. They probably have great clients. It's
Yeah.
probably helpful,
Yeah.
right? Don't be looking at people just because they don't have credentials as they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, on our podcast, I do a podcast with Josh Berger, who's also, I think, a member of the community,
Hmm.
called the Tennis IQ podcast. One of our best conversations was with a tennis coach who also runs a business called Mindset College, named David Sammel. He doesn't have a degree in anything, but he's got an amazing set of experiences and exposure to a lot of great people. And he's put together this great program, and he works with players and so helps them through that process. And that was one of my favorite episodes, you know, just getting him to talk about what he's doing out
Yeah.
there. And so I would just, stay open-minded about all these things. You can learn from anybody.
Well, and I
Um,
think you raise a really interesting point here. And I don't want to oversimplify it by giving it a label, but I think from our conversations, one of the biggest influences I ever had in my career was when I came across an article talking about how counseling had tried to organize all these theories. And ever since then, this idea of alignment has just been almost branded in my brain, and I can't get rid of it no matter how I'm trying to learn. But it opens the idea of not being shy from looking at other literature, because no, we don't want to be theory smushing or things like that, or taking things out of context from what it was intended to do. But there's a lot of ways of getting at it. And when you and the client are on the same page with what's going on and what's needed, well, now let's go ahead and line some things up. And then to your point, if it's not working, we'll shift gears, but that's on us, right? How much are we going to be patient, kind of see this through? Um, how much education does this person need, right? To make sure that they're understanding it in a perceived way, right? I think your comment on emotions alone is it's worth its own podcast episode. But because there's so many disciplines out there, don't stay in the sports psych bubble, right? These same topics are being discussed in other disciplines as well. And I think the more you can kind of look at it, number one, I think it might, certain things are going to resonate you in different ways. So I think there's a lot of value there, and be open-minded, learn. What's the worst case that happens? You learn something and then you change your mind about it because you learned something else. Changing your mind's a good thing. Right? It means you're trying things out and learning. So I think there's a lot there. And I think there's the idea of learning from other things is great. And coming back to what I think is still a strength of yours, even from day one when we first met, is you do have process. I might change out the assessments I might use on the front end, right? For an example, but I have a process in which me and the client get to know each other. After that, then we put a plan together. Then I support the plan and we adjust as we need to, right? So you have the process. So now as I'm gaining all this knowledge, there's different opportunities to add to the repertoire to better meet, athletes where they're at. And that still comes from your philosophy. I just think the cool part I don't think a lot of us have had is how can we also do the same thing for athletes to really spur their own curiosity, so they're really leaning in and trying things out. So anyway, I'm jumping around here, but I think the point is that your philosophy clearly has had a big influence on you being a lifelong learner in what you're doing, expanding your repertoire, willing to look at these things, but you still have process as well that you can follow. So you're able to organize it all, in your head.
Yeah, and I think I want to circle back to one thing you said earlier, but
Sure.
to talk about process too, like how do you begin to expose your athletes to wisdom and philosophies of excellence and so forth? So part of my experience over these years has been putting together a collection of articles, books, videos that I will share with athletes as part of my engagement with them. So every week I assign what I call a mental training workout. And it's meant to be about 30 minutes of activity that they can either do in one block or they can spread it out over the course of the week. And it very often will have, some mindfulness element to it, maybe concentration work, but also reading an article, watching a video, and then I provide questions for discussion that I want to bring up the next time we meet, because I want people to watch these things and take something away. And a lot of times the questions are, what are your takeaways?
Yeah.
What of this article resonated with you? And then we go deeper into that, because then many of these things that I share become the backbone for how they're going to begin approaching what they're experiencing in whatever sport that they're playing. And that has been really, really helpful, Russ, is to kind of systematize the exposure to philosophies of excellence, perspectives, wisdom, etc. The thing I wanted to circle back toward was this idea of maybe not practicing publicly. Richard Keegan talks about practicing publicly, not having this secret sauce. And I try to be as publicly practicing as I can. I'm willing to share whatever. And I know I've said that even in some of the meetings that we've had with the community. Because to me, we're not bettering the society if we're keeping this great piece of information locked up only for people who will pay me. And I prefer to see my role in this, and I'm not doing research, obviously, but occasionally I might come across something good that I did. I don't think it's a good idea for me to just keep that to myself. I would want everybody to be able to have this opportunity to learn and experience something that is possibly going to work for them. So to me, I don't have a secret sauce I'm not going to tell you about, but I will try to be as open and honest with my fellow practitioners as I can about what I do.
Yeah.
And then I'd love to learn more about what other people do. That's actually been one of the awesome parts about our Josh and I doing the podcast, is we have a lot of unscripted conversations that we both end up leaving better
Yeah.
because of the way we just discuss the info. And so I would encourage people to be as public as they feel comfortable with, because there are enough clients out there. There's enough business out there for all of us. I don't think you're going to, lose business because you told somebody you do something a certain way.
Yeah.
And I think the more that we hold on to the betterment of society versus, my own personal wallet, the better you'll feel and the
Yeah.
better your practice will grow.
Well, and I think in that same vein, for those who are looking at their philosophy, or still working towards having a process they can kind of get behind, anything else that you feel like is valuable, or lessons learned on your behalf that you think they could benefit from?
I mean, you may have covered some of this in some of the other community stuff, but I know we've talked about curriculum, the development of curriculum. I
Sure.
think there's also developing a process around sort of the logistics of how you do what you do. And that might even just be how you organize your own files, how you organize your own notes, how whatever your preparation routine is for getting ready for the day or for a particular session and how you reflect upon that. So I think there are multiple levels that we can institute process or systems
Sure.
there so that you feel ultimately prepared. And I think one of the things that preparation, along with having a curriculum or a number of topics that you can discuss, means that you come to your sessions just ready to talk about something rather than it just being open ended, like, oh, hey, what's going on today, Russ?
Yeah.
Right? And because especially at first, that can happen because maybe you haven't had the experience of like putting things together. I know, like when I first began, there might have been like three things I could talk about.
Yeah.
And that was about it, and you learn through that and you figure
Yeah.
things out. And but the more you educate yourself, the more you can put a lot of stuff together and you figure out, hey, what's a potentially optimal progression? But hey, how could I plug and play a little bit
Yeah.
this based on who I'm talking to? Um, and yeah, I just think you should always just be looking to develop your library of content, what
Yeah.
you can share, exercises you can do. And the more that you have of that, like I have after all these years, I have so many resources. Even that's beginning to get a bit unwieldy, but um, it makes it so easy to go to stuff. It's like, oh yeah, I have an exercise for that. I got something for that. Oh yeah, we can talk about it from this perspective or that perspective. All right, here's an article. Here's a video. And it's all just at my fingertips at this point. And I think the more one can create content and curriculum, the better off you'll be.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And I just was thinking about that as we kind of round up our conversation for today on philosophy and kind of the approach to your work. Probably only fitting that we end on, um, considerations for logistics. How
Yeah.
are where are we literally? Let's not make it harder than it has to be, philosophy or not. Just how are we kind of organizing our files and our processes around things, I think is um, valid. I know one thing I've tried to tell individuals who are even struggling with, um, their why, if you want to call it that, or philosophy. How about you just capture what you're doing, and then just continue to work and reflect on what you're doing, and then after a while, some things will start clicking, and then you're going to know, like, okay, none of this stuff resonated with me in school, but it sure does now because I've seen about 100 athletes. Here's the topics we're hitting. This is what we're running out. And I'm finding myself really gravitating towards X, Y, and Z, or really finding this inspirational with how I'm managing relationships. And then also, before you know it, you do have a philosophy. Um, so I think even just giving them something concrete to start with how they're organizing what they have today, I think makes a ton of sense and be very, very helpful.
Yeah. And then the more you read, look, I mean, for me, you asked earlier that I didn't get to it. What were the sort of the early influences, right?
Mhm.
Um, so some books that really helped me get started with one was The Four Agreements by
Hmm.
Don Miguel Ruiz, I think. Very simple, short book. A book I was exposed to in college was The Greatest Salesman in the World by Og Mandino. And those are like great, just like very basic starters that you can even introduce a lot of those concepts to your athletes, especially those who are teenagers. Um, and then from there, the Ryan Holiday books, Ego is the Enemy, The Obstacle is the Way. I think The Obstacle is the Way was one that was very popular in the NFL back around like 2013, 14, 15. Both the Patriots and the Seahawks read it the year they went to the Super Bowl. And I thought that was great to see professional coaches and athletes gravitating toward, um, philosophy and ways of looking at, say, obstacles or the ego in different contexts so that you could perform better. And so I think those are some good real starter material. And then you'll just see the references in each of these and you'll just want to go to other places naturally.
Yeah. Well, and I think to summarize everything today too, consume before you create. I think it's a great way to look at it, because the more we just continue to want to learn, our perspectives will always change and evolve, and the ideas will become more fluent and easier for us as we're putting things into practice. Um, But I just wanted to hit that because I think that's a nice way of summarizing everything, whether it's from the books we're consuming or our peers we're collaborating with and sharing ideas with, or from, how we're learning from our clients and our athletes. I think it's all valuable. Well, Brian, I want to say thank you for coming on today and kickstarting philosophy and how you've looked at it, both for yourself and then also with your athletes, which is a very creative process as well to learn about. Um, I want to thank you for your time, and otherwise, any final words before we wrap it up?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I hope it was a relatively coherent discussion. Sometimes these things, you never know where they're going to go, but I hope there were some nuggets for people to gravitate toward. And of course, anybody who would like to follow up with me and discuss more on a personal basis or anything like that, I'd be more than happy to do that. So, but yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk to the community, Russ, and on a topic that obviously both of us have some passion around.
Well, it is, and it's a fun one, and it's needed. So I appreciate you taking time on it, and thanks so much. And we'll talk to you soon.